truly totally out of thin air. But if you look at the bottom part of that chart, it gives you the number of cases where the court says attorney's fees were settled, but no amount was given. So in those cases, 2 for Wild Earth, 3 for Western Watersheds, 15 for Sierra Club, 8 for CBD, the court documents indicate attorney's fees were paid, but no amount was attached. So my total figures do not include a guess for those cases, because we don't even know what those are.
So if we're going to do some kind of reform dealing with Egypt first, obviously the first thing we have to do is get the federal government to track what it's actually paying out.
Yes, and they should know. I mean, it's not like they've got 14 places to write checks from. Treasury should know.
Have you ever asked for that data?
Yes,
and,
I have.
And Representative Lummis, you've asked for that data? Has that been given to you?
I used the Freedom of Information Act request to request at both of the Treasury Department and of Justice Department. The figures they gave me, we discovered later through looking through PACER, were wrong. Unless you require them through an accounting bill to actually track those figures, I do not believe that we will ever know exactly how much is paid.
Do you have a few other simple things that we could do right now? Because once again, that becomes a bill that's not in the jurisdiction of our committees. But certain things we can do, as in, like, what would be the criteria for someone actually to get paid? Do they have to win on all points, some points? Should there be a threshold level?
I think that one of the first things we need to do is look at serial litigants. I think that when you file 215 cases in 3 years against the federal government, you should not be paid in near so many cases. I think that truly shows this sue and settle mentality, so that's the first thing I would do.
Do we have litigants who will, like, file 25 different points expecting maybe to win 3 or 2 of those?
Yes.
And they get paid fully for that?
In fact, I have discovered cases, and I can get you the documents, where litigants didn't win a single point and Justice Department settled attorney's fees with them anyway, because the Justice Department can settle for attorney's fees than anything they want. So even if you don't win the case,
you can still get paid.
You can still get paid.
That is slang. All right, let's go back there as well as that, because there are some provisions we have been talking about, that there are agencies, because an agency has to defend itself. If there are 25 points upon which they are being sued, an agency has to spend the time and money and effort to defend themselves on all 25 points. And even if they're not serious on those points, it's just it's an effort to try and bog down the system in litigation costs. If we were to insist that if somebody was going to get reimbursed, they would have to win all 25, not just 1 or 2, would that have an effort of trying to at least get the litigants to shrink down what they are doing and what they are suing, so we don't have to be bogged down in litigation costs on the agency level?
I think that would help, because it would force them to actually pick claims that are winnable instead of just filing complaints. I have actually seen complaints that mirror each other. They just change the name of the grazing allotment. And so you'll get 10 complaints filed, names of the grazing allotments are changed, and in fact I've got cases in my office that I can show you where they'll get some of the names changed, but all of the names changed. So you'll be reading a complaint and all of a sudden it'll be the prior allotment in the prior decision, and I've got cases of those filed by attorneys today.
Some of their clerks aren't doing a good enough proofreading.
That's right.
Okay.
Find and replace doesn't seem to be working in all cases.
And we won't mention things like sage grouse, which they keep telling us they're required by law to do, even though it was a sue and settlement agreement. No
Absolutely.
one actually forced
it was
them
part
to
of
do
this
that.
2001 settlement agreement between Justice Department and Wild Earth Guardian Center for Biological Diversity. The case was settled, $300,000 and attorney's fees were paid for 2 settlements. The original litigation dealt with 113 species. The final settlement agreement expanded to 1,053 decisions that have to be made in 5 years.
And that was by sue and settlement.
Absolutely sue and settle. Not a single substantive brief was filed in that litigation.
And I don't know why anyone should be upset about that. That seems perfectly logical to me. Randy, let me ask you, in your expert opinion, are we in danger under current circumstances of overgrazing? It is possible, obviously, to overgraze land. Are we in that situation of overgrazing?
And that's always a concern, especially when in Utah and in the Great Basin, we're in the 4th year of a drought. But I think a lot of people downplay the fact, Congressman, that these farmers or these ranchers that are grazing livestock out there, they're terrific stewards of the land. They know that if they abuse the land, that next year they're not going to have the resources to fall back on. They understand that. They understand the forage better than the agency scientists. They know what comes back, what it takes. In Nevada, as an example, the BLM over there is shutting people down from grazing after rains have come across and the grasses have just skyrocketed. They still won't change their grazing plans.
So is there a nexus then between grazing and proper maintenance of the land? As in one of my colleagues from New Jersey was saying, well, obviously we can have better land if we just keep all the cows off of all the land. Is that counterproductive?
That's absolutely counterproductive for two reasons. One, the plant community out there is established, has been developed by grazing animals, so their health is predicated on that. The second piece of that is this little thing called catastrophic wildfire. If it's not harvested, how many tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars could be saved by grazing those judiciously and moving that into cattle and sheep?
Yeah, but some will say wildfire is natural. I mean, it's not intelligent, but they would say that. Yeah. Okay, so you talked about the loss of AUMs. I'm assuming for all of you, AUMs have a monetary value.
Yes.
Have any of you used them as collateral for any kind of loans?
Chairman Bishop, yes. As we, of course, have our operating loans and that, the banks do require collateral, and those AUMs, both Forest Service and BLM, are used for collateral.
So was there any kind of compensation, any kind of ask when you were asked to do a voluntary withdrawal or a voluntary lack of use of your AUM, was there any kind of compensation for that? So in essence, anyone living in the livestock industry basically just lost value.
It just goes away.
I was trying to think and rack my brain of who would pay us that compensation. The federal BLM AUMs, if you are required not to graze or nothing, there is no compensation. They do have a value, so that makes them something that you can have collateral on. However, when they arbitrarily take them away, all of a sudden you've lost that value. Your banks start looking at you in a different way. They become reluctant to make loans.
So I don't care how you officially call it, that still is a taking. Somebody ought to have that in at least part of the equation before you make the ask. That should be part of the equation. I got to have a question. You got to help me on I'm sorry. Am I? On the rule, the way from the Department of Labor. Can you help me with the nexus of that? Because this is a rule that's supposedly asking a private entity, a rancher in this case, or a sheep herder sheepman in this case, to do something on a wage scale. And how does the federal government have the nexus to insist upon that? I mean, I can understand how the president could sign a declaration and say, okay, for federal employees, this will be the minimum wage. I see a nexus there. How does that come with you in the private sector? What connection are they using to insist upon that?
I will take a stab at this. We get these employees through the H-2A program. There was special procedures in that program. One of those procedures set the wage rate by the federal government as the adverse affected wage rate. With that and our having to get those permits to bring these gentlemen in from other countries to herd the sheep, I think that's part of the nexus that
so they're using that as the immigration issue is what they're using to say this has. If this were to go into effect, how do you see that program going forward in the future? Are you going to be able to have more H-2A workers?
I'm going to comment, and I'm sure Pat will have a comment on this. We will not be in business, and the issue it takes, they've given us a 5-year, or one of their proposals of the rule is a 5-year phase-in period. By year 3, we're all gone. The other issue with that is, as we start to sell these livestock, these sheep and that is a generational development of herds that are gone. These herds know where they go, they know where they live, they know where they return to on these trails, especially these large range flocks. The genetics are gone. You cannot replace that. There is no way to survive this. And the main issue is we can't go and say, okay, we're going to pay more wages. and we're going to up our prices. It'll work. Our prices are set by international markets. We are tied to those.
I think the question you asked is a good question. By the time we unravel it all, we'll have a lot of answers that'll be very troubling to all of us. The problem is, you know, and as you've seen it in many other issues, we're looking at a rule that came out of nowhere in the middle of April that is supposed to be released the 1st of November and implemented in December. And so I can tell you, I've talked to people all over this industry. We're going to look at a sell-off, and just to give you the idea of the kind of values. If you were to sell off my family's sheep and try to replace it with cows because of the variability of markets, we'd probably lose half our income. And so, what we see is it's the immediacy that is the most troubling, and it's the federal nexus where we're, not only the wage side, which is troubling enough, and I think you can get to outfitters or beekeepers or the people that do wheat. All of them are going to be under the same kind of a federal nexus system on wage, but it's the rules that then, we have tried to establish good relationships with BLM and Forest Service in these negotiations on sage grouse. They are the ones saying where there's a bird, there's a herd, or where there's a herd, there's a bird, vice versa. We all know that. It's where we graze that there is the most prolific numbers of a potential endangered species. It's because of predator control. It's because there's people on the ground. It's because of that grazing component. So I wish it wasn't the case, but I tell you, when we sit down together, if we're not talking about horses, we're talking about what is the alternative when you have an economic disaster in front of you. And I'm happy to run cows or sheep. Our family likes doing both, but the economics are based on. Let me just give you an example. If I have 1,000 AUMs, by the time that the BLM or the Forest Service would analyze how I could transfer to cattle, I would have 300 if I was lucky. And so what you're doing is you're taking that AUM issue that you went right to the heart of, and those will be eliminated because the sheep are in places that the cows can't go, or the federal agencies have done a bias test on the livestock industry where if you switch from sheep to cattle, you lose essentially the heart of your operation.
I'd say this, I see so many similarities here. You guys are no different than any other business or industry that's out there. And if I'm dealing with other industries that have contracts, manufacturing industries that have contracts with the United States government, there seems to be a mindset of a lot of people that you can simply, even if you have a workforce, you can simply turn them off and turn them on. That you can stop buying from them, all of a sudden they'll be there when you want it a couple of years later. And what I think you're telling me is, you can't, your industry, you can't turn it on and turn it off. It's not a spigot. If it's going to go, it's going to go, and it's not going to come back. And there are some deep situations. Can I just one last thing of anybody here, and I apologize.
Don't apologize. You're on a roll, man.
And it deals with the concept of science. So on anything with this wage, with the labor rule, or the others, can you talk about, do you see any science they've used with that? And the reason I tell you this goes back to sage-grouse, fun product. So as I understand it, sage-grouse rule was done on the Sioux settlement. It was not necessarily based on science.
Yes.
Governor of Idaho did a FOIA request asking for some stuff from Fish and Wildlife Service. And if I summarize those emails, it was basically, this is what we're going to do. Does anyone have some science out there that can back it up? And then the Fish and Wildlife Director came in front of our committee and said, well, when we don't have science, we have to use our best guess estimates. And then when there was some other science that my predecessor as chairman had that contradicted what they were doing, they rejected that as not being peer-reviewed science.
Right.
Which leads me to wonder, what the hell's happening here. So, as you look back as it affects your industry, is there any science that you have seen? Did they come out and watch your operations? Did they base it on anything? Or is this once again agencies coming up with their best guess estimates in lieu of this? And look, I'm an old history teacher, so I don't like science anyway. That was my worst subject in school. But I sometimes think we use science as the excuse for doing what we want to do when it's not really based on science. Do you see anything that would promulgate these rules upon which they can say, yeah, this was the science we reviewed and we have some way to form that data?
If I might quickly just say, the efforts in Congress to look at a longer-term time before there would be any potential listing is based on the science, and I'm kind of right in the middle of it. The science is still being developed. It isn't real yet, and nobody will tell you that it's real because we're all learning. But I think a good example is the Delta smelt, which I'm sure you're familiar with, where the judge who spent his whole career working on that issue said the manipulation of the science by the Fish and Wildlife Service is the most egregious use of government dollars that I've ever seen in my career. I mean, that's what's so troubling about this. We'll figure it out. And again, you know, this reality of the sheep and cattle being where the animal is, that gives you a pretty good analogy that it's our landscapes that we've developed all these generations, why it's here.
I would comment, first of all, that in eastern Wyoming, we have a noxious weed problem that, especially along the Powder River in northeast Wyoming, it's called leafy spurge, and it's really hard to eradicate. And along the Powder River, there are a lot of really old cottonwoods. And the only way to prevent the spread of leafy spurge along the Powder River and without killing the cottonwoods is through sheep and goat intensive grazing, and they have to be herded. I wonder if one of the unintended consequences of implementation of this H-2A labor rule is the spread of noxious weeds in areas like that. And of course they use them to control fire in California along those steep hillsides that are very fire prone. When they become overgrown, the sheep are brought in, or the goats are brought in to eat the grass down to a level that will not provide catastrophic amounts of fuel that would generate fires. So that's something that we all may want to consider as well during all this. My final question is